podcast. So one of the things I was thinking about is why all these school shootings? And I was just working with a middle school who had an incident where a student who had been bullied, who had been picked on, who had been ridiculed by his peers, decided that the only way that he could get power or feel powerful was to lash out by talking about committing gun violence to particular students. And so the school did the right thing, particularly in light of a number of things that have happened throughout the United States in terms of school shootings. And they responded as they should, pretty traditional. They talked to the parents. They gave they suspended the student for a number of days. They did some wraparound services around the student. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, that as we were engaging in these conversations, that one of the students made mention of the fact that this particular student is bearing the brunt for a problem that he did not cause, that this student was responding in a way that was not necessarily socially acceptable. However, the treatment prior to his lashing out really was not also acceptable. So, as a response to bullying, this student made this declaration of harming other students, and I thought that was a very compelling statement to really think about, because then I started thinking about these other students that had done that, and then I started looking at some of their other commonalities. And one of the things that stuck out for me was the fact that as I started looking at these students who are committing these acts of violence in school settings, there is a typology that starts to form after you look at these things. And the easy place to go to is that these middle class kind of kids that are doing this are male, right? So that's one place to go. The other place to go is that they're white males. And once you at least start peering into that, and we ask ourselves, why gun violence? It becomes very clear, or at least it became very clear to me, that there's something going on with our middle class white boys who are not a part of the popular or the dominant crowd, whatever that looks like. And as I started piercing through that, and I was asking some adults about this and what they thought about that, and one thing that came up was that people were saying that it is white supremacy that is driving this. And that didn't quite sit well with me, because I know what white supremacy is supposed to be, and I don't think white supremacy is the problem that we make it out to be. I think the real problem is white primacy, but that's a whole nother topic, and we'll talk about that later. But as we were teasing this out, and they went straight to these kind of racial notions of what is motivating this, because the race became the factor by which they kind of defined why these boys are responding this way. And I would agree that their whiteness has something to do with it. But more importantly, what I suspect, and I have to, maybe some folks can call in and we can talk about this, but what I suspect is that these middle class or lower middle class or working class white boys lack some skills in resilience that their kids of color, their students, their counterparts that are, African American, Hispanic, Asian, the immigrants, that these other groups have developed, for better or for worse, developed skills of resiliency that somehow these white middle class or working class white boys have not been either taught or have overlooked, or maybe their parents are trying to shield them from some rough realities of life. One of those being that all white people are not created equal. And I use this in my workshops, and I talk about this both in jest, but to also make a point that white people who don't measure up to the level of sophistication that white people think that they should, white people have a name for that. They call them, rednecks, right? They call them rednecks or solo cut people or hillbillies, or I mean there are all sorts of names, and I'm not condoning any of those names, but what I do use that as an example to demonstrate that this concept of whiteness can also sometimes be harmful to white people as well as to people of color. And so to that end, I really was able to really try to critically analyze that and start thinking. And this is going to sound really weird coming from me, who is, I do diversity and inclusion work. I'm anti-racism. I'm anti-racist and I work on anti-racism and all these kinds of things. But I really do believe that our white boys need some training about how to build resilience, particularly when they find that their whiteness isn't getting them everything that has been promised to them, right? So that's it. That's an interesting conversation. And so I looked for some friends and some allies that could help me kind of demystify this idea of what resilience is. Why this gun violence? What's going on in the psyche of our society. And so I bumped into a woman who I hope will become a dear friend, both to this podcast as well as someone that I can lean on to really help me understand the psychology of what we're dealing with. And that's Dr. Nikisha Hammond. And she is a psychologist out of Pennsylvania. She does a lot of work in Florida, both with families and communities and schools around ADHD. She has written a book, and she'll talk about that stuff. But I really wanted to spend time with her because it was I needed to understand what was going on in not only in our country but with our young people and our youth, so we can figure out how do we help them before they become maladjusted adults or be placed in situations that we can't understand why they would do that. And I would suggest that if we don't start paying attention to what it is that all of our children need, what is compelling young people to stand up in the face of national organizations and say, we defy you, or you have to listen to us. And until we're able to recognize that, we'll continue to see these canaries in the mine. And if people aren't familiar with that, miners used to use canaries in the mines with them to notify them of deadly gases or things that could kill them in the mine. And so when they saw a canary die, that was a sign to them that this is not a safe place for us. And I would say that these school shootings are telling us a lot about what's going on in our school systems. And so Dr. Nikisha Hammond was really helping me kind of look at and analyze and talk about this idea of resilience. What we also know is that criminals are lazy, right? And so any resistance to criminal activity is a deterrent, right? Anytime you can slow them down or whatnot. And I don't mean lazy in the sense that they're not willing. Well, anyway. But I do think it's interesting that our schools have these signs that say no guns allowed. And so what that says to me is if I have a gun and no one else has a gun, I have a strategic advantage. Take that and use that for however you want to use that. But I do think that is that's an interesting decision that we've made to post those signs. But I don't want to delay this any longer. I want to get you to listen to the interview that I had with Dr. Nikisha Hammond, and she is America's #1 psychologist, or America's favorite psychologist, and I think you'll hear why. All right, so now can I do the outro?
Yeah.
All right.
Everyone.
So it should be pretty obvious why Dr. Keisha Hammond is America's favorite psychologist. what we want you to do is to take the concepts that we talked about today in this particular episode and think about, how do you help build resiliency with the young people around you? How have you built resiliency within yourself? And the importance of reaching across these so-called racial barriers, these so-called racial categories, to actually create a better world, not only just for youth that look like you, or youth look like you, or in your neighborhood, but actually take responsibility for all of our youth. Because what we know is that there will be no more resources added to this planet. The planet is, people say it's getting smaller, but actually it's getting more populated. There will be no new resources. And so the management for what happens on this planet is in our hands. This is Andre Koen. Thank you for joining us for another episode of The Armchair Activist, and we look to see you do something. We're out of here.
Cool. Sounds good.
Cool.
I like that.
Okay, cool. All right, Facebook Live, we're out of here. See you guys later.